Sunday morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, casting jeweled patterns of blue and gold across the worn wooden pews. The small church had served the community for over a century, its simple architecture and warm atmosphere drawing families who valued tradition and genuine fellowship over grand displays. The organ's gentle melody filled the sacred space as morning service reached the time for silent prayer. Congregants bowed their heads in personal reflection, the sanctuary filled with that particular peace that comes when people gather to seek something greater than themselves. In the third row from the front, 5-year-old Sophie Matthews knelt on the cushioned kneeler, her small hands folded in perfect prayer position, just as her mother had taught her. Her blonde curls caught the morning light streaming through the windows, and her white Sunday dress was carefully pressed and spotless, evidence of the care her mother took in presenting their best selves to the world, even when times were difficult. Sophie's bright blue eyes were fixed on the large wooden cross at the front of the church, her expression holding the serious concentration that children bring to important conversations. While the adults around her prayed silently in their minds, Sophie whispered her prayer aloud in the innocent belief that speaking directly to God was the most natural thing in the world. "Dear God," she began in a voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for Mommy and for our house and for my stuffed bunny, Mr. Whiskers." She paused, glancing around to make sure she wasn't being too loud, then continued with the earnest honesty that only children possess. "God, I have a really important wish. I just want a dad for Mommy. She's so lonely, and sometimes I hear her crying when she thinks I'm asleep." 3 rows behind Sophie, David Harrison sat alone in his usual spot near the back of the church. At 42, David was a tall man with kind brown eyes and graying hair at his temples. He wore a simple navy suit and had been attending St. Mary's regularly for the past 3 years, ever since moving to town after his wife's death. David had developed the habit of sitting in the back pew, finding comfort in being part of the congregation while maintaining the emotional distance he'd cultivated since losing Sarah. He came to church seeking peace and perhaps forgiveness for the guilt he carried about surviving when his wife hadn't. But this morning, Sophie's whispered prayer cut through his carefully maintained emotional barriers like a blade through silk. "She tries to be happy for me," Sophie continued, unaware that her words were being overheard. "But I can tell she's sad. When other daddies come pick up their kids from school, Mommy's smile gets different. Not fake, but sadder." David's chest tightened as he listened to this small child articulate feelings he recognized from his own experience. The loneliness, the putting on a brave face, the way loss changes even genuine smiles into something tinged with melancholy. "I don't need a dad for me," Sophie whispered, her voice growing even softer, but somehow more determined. "I just want Mommy to have someone to hold her hand and make her laugh the real way again. Could you maybe send someone nice? Someone who would love us both?" The prayer concluded with the simple amen that Sophie had been taught. But David found himself unable to move, unable to breathe normally, unable to process the direct hit to his heart that her innocent words had delivered. For 3 years, David had convinced himself that his grief was a private matter, that his loss was his to bear alone, that reaching out to others would somehow diminish Sarah's memory or betray the love they'd shared. He had attended church faithfully, but maintained careful distance from real connection, protecting himself from the possibility of loss by avoiding the risk of love. But Sophie's prayer had shattered his defenses with the devastating honesty of a child who simply wanted her mother to be happy. As Father Miguel invited the congregation to stand for the final hymn, David rose slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for his handkerchief. He wiped his eyes discreetly, hoping no one would notice the tears that he couldn't quite control. For the first time in 3 years, David found himself really looking at the other congregation members instead of just existing among them. And when his gaze fell on the blonde woman in the third row, gently helping her daughter find the right page in the hymnal, he saw something he had been too wrapped in his own grief to notice before. Emily Matthews had the same careful smile Sophie had described, genuine but touched with sadness, brave but lonely. And in that moment, David began to wonder if perhaps some prayers were meant to be answered by the people hearing them. Where are you watching this video right now? At home? at work, or during your rest time? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing from each and every one of you. 4 years earlier, Emily Matthews had been living what most people would consider a perfect life. She was a beloved third-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, married to her college sweetheart Michael, and celebrating Sophie's first birthday in their cozy suburban home filled with laughter and dreams for the future. Michael worked as a paramedic, a job he'd chosen because he wanted to help people during their most vulnerable moments. He was the kind of man who stopped to help strangers change flat tires, who volunteered at the fire department on weekends, and who never met a child who didn't immediately adore him. Their last conversation had been about plans for Sophie's birthday party the following weekend. Michael had promised to pick up decorations after his shift ended, and Emily had laughed at his elaborate ideas for a princess-themed celebration that would probably be more exciting for the adults than for their 1-year-old daughter. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Emily had been sleeping peacefully when the phone's ring shattered the quiet house. As a paramedic's wife, she was accustomed to emergency calls, but something about the hour and the hesitant voice on the other end made her blood run cold. Michael's ambulance had been responding to a highway accident when a drunk driver, fleeing the scene of another collision, had struck them head-on. Michael's partner survived with serious injuries. Michael died instantly, according to the emergency room doctor who delivered the news with professional compassion that couldn't soften its devastating impact. The months that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, and the overwhelming challenge of learning to be a single mother while drowning in grief. Emily's parents lived across the country, and Michael's family, while supportive, were dealing with their own loss and couldn't provide the daily help she desperately needed. The financial realities became apparent quickly. Michael's life insurance helped with immediate expenses, but Emily's teacher's salary, while sufficient for a 2-income household, barely covered the mortgage, child care, and basic necessities for herself and Sophie. She took on tutoring work in the evenings and sold crafts online, but there was never enough to feel secure. More challenging than the financial struggles was the emotional isolation. Emily found herself surrounded by married friends whose lives continued on their expected trajectories, while hers had been completely derailed. Well-meaning neighbors would invite her to dinner parties where she felt like a tragic reminder of how quickly life could change, or they would avoid her entirely, perhaps afraid that her widowhood might somehow be contagious. Sophie, at barely 2 years old when Michael died, had no real memories of her father, but seemed to sense his absence in ways that broke Emily's heart. She would ask questions about why other children had daddies when she didn't, or wonder aloud why mommy cried sometimes when she thought Sophie wasn't looking. Emily tried to maintain normalcy for Sophie's sake, creating traditions and routines that would give her daughter a sense of stability. Sunday church became part of that routine, a place where Sophie could participate in community activities and Emily could find some measure of peace, even if she often felt like she was going through the motions of faith rather than truly experiencing it. The hardest moments were the unexpected ones. Parent-teacher conferences where every other child had 2 adults attending, school plays where Sophie would scan the audience looking for the daddy who wasn't there, bedtime stories where Sophie would ask if angels could visit Earth and take care of mommies who seemed sad. Emily developed the skill that many single parents master, the ability to appear strong and capable while privately struggling with exhaustion, loneliness, and the constant fear that she wasn't enough for her daughter. She smiled at school events, volunteered for classroom activities, and maintained the appearance of someone who had successfully navigated tragedy and emerged intact. But late at night, after Sophie was asleep, Emily would sit in the living room that still contained traces of the life she'd planned. Michael's favorite chair, photos from their honeymoon, the coffee maker they'd received as a wedding gift, and confront the reality that she had decades of loneliness ahead of her. David Harrison's story began 3 years ago, with a different kind of loss, but a similar outcome. His wife Sarah had battled cancer for 18 months, and during that time, David had gradually watched the woman he adored disappear piece by piece. Unlike Michael's sudden death, Sarah's passing had been anticipated, prepared for, discussed in detail with doctors and counselors. But knowing loss is coming doesn't make it easier to bear. David had moved to town specifically to start over, leaving behind the house where Sarah had died, the job that held too many memories, and the friends who meant well but couldn't stop seeing him as half of the couple he used to be. He found work as an accountant with a local firm, bought a modest apartment, and began the process of learning to live as a single person after 15 years of marriage. Church attendance had begun as an attempt to honor Sarah's memory. She had been deeply faithful, but had gradually become David's anchor in a life that often felt adrift. He appreciated the routine, the community, and the way Sunday mornings provided structure to weeks that otherwise blended together in solitary routine. Both Emily and David had learned to navigate their respective losses, but neither had learned to hope for anything beyond survival. They existed in the same small community, attended the same church, and shared similar struggles, but they had never really seen each other. Until Sophie's prayer created a moment of recognition that changed everything. In the weeks following Sophie's prayer, David found himself paying attention to details he'd previously overlooked. He noticed how Emily always arrived at church precisely 5 minutes before service began, hurrying in with Sophie's hand firmly clasped in hers and settling into their usual pew with practiced efficiency. He observed how she helped Sophie navigate the hymnal and prayer book, her patience evident even when her daughter whispered questions during quiet moments. He saw how Emily's smile brightened when she spoke with other congregation members, but held a careful quality that suggested she was maintaining social connections rather than truly connecting. Most importantly, David began to notice the small struggles that single parenthood created, struggles he recognized because they mirrored his own experience of navigating life without a partner. The first time David acted on his growing awareness was a rainy Tuesday morning when he happened to be driving past the elementary school where Emily taught. He saw her car stopped in the parking lot, hazard lights blinking, with Emily standing beside it holding an umbrella and looking at her phone with obvious distress. David pulled over and approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me, are you having car trouble?" Emily looked up, recognizing him from church but clearly uncertain about accepting help from someone she knew only by sight. "The engine just died," she said, glancing toward the school building where her first-grade students would be arriving soon. "I've called for a tow truck, but I can't afford to miss work, and I don't know how I'm going to get Sophie to her daycare." "I could give you a ride," David offered. "I work downtown, so I pass right by Little Angel's daycare. And I could look at your car. I'm not a mechanic, but sometimes these things are simpler than they seem." Emily hesitated, clearly weighing her options and her natural caution about accepting help from relative strangers against her immediate need for practical assistance. "I really don't want to impose," she said. "It's not an imposition," David replied gently. "It's what neighbors do for each other." The car problem turned out to be a loose battery cable that David was able to fix in 5 minutes with a small wrench from his emergency kit. Emily was so grateful that she insisted on buying him coffee the following Sunday after church, which led to their first real conversation. "I feel like I should know you better, since we've been attending the same church for months," Emily said as they stood in the fellowship hall with cups of coffee and Sophie playing nearby with other children. "I tend to keep to myself," David admitted. "I moved here about 3 years ago, after my wife passed away, still figuring out how to be part of a community again." Emily's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss. I lost my husband 4 years ago, so I understand something about starting over." They talked for 20 minutes about safe topics, their work, the church community, Sophie's enthusiasm for Sunday school. But beneath the surface conversation, both recognized something familiar in the other: the careful way they navigated social interactions, the slight hesitation before laughing at jokes, the automatic way they checked on Sophie while maintaining adult conversation. From that point forward, David began offering assistance in ways that felt natural rather than intrusive. When Emily mentioned that her gutters needed cleaning before winter, David showed up the following Saturday with a ladder and cleaning supplies. When Sophie expressed interest in learning to ride a bike, David appeared at the park with training wheels and infinite patience. Other congregation members began to notice David's attention to Emily and Sophie. Mrs. Henderson, who had known Emily since Sophie was a baby, mentioned to her bridge club that nice man David seems to have taken a special interest in helping our Emily. Father Miguel observed the growing friendship with the gentle approval of someone who had seen many of his parishioners find comfort in unexpected connections. But perhaps most importantly, Sophie began to light up whenever she saw David approaching. She would run to him after church services, eager to share stories about her week or show him drawings she'd made in Sunday school. David listened with the attention of someone who genuinely enjoyed children's perspectives, and he had a gift for asking questions that made Sophie feel important and heard. "Mr. David, do you like coloring?" Sophie asked one Sunday as they walked out of church together. "I haven't colored in a long time," David replied seriously. "Do you think I've forgotten how?" "I could teach you," Sophie offered, "but you have to stay inside the lines most of the time, or it doesn't look right." Emily watched these interactions with growing warmth. Sophie had been polite but reserved around most adults since Michael's death, but she bloomed around David in a way that reminded Emily of how naturally social her daughter could be when she felt secure. "He's good with her," Emily confided to her friend Maria after church one Sunday. "Sophie doesn't warm up to people easily anymore, but she acts like she's known David her whole life." "Maybe she has," Maria replied with a knowing smile. "Sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them, even if we don't realize we were waiting." Emily wasn't ready to think about David in romantic terms, but she couldn't deny that having a friend who understood loss and single parenthood made her feel less isolated than she had in years. For the first time since Michael's death, Sunday afternoons didn't stretch endlessly ahead of her, because she often spent them in David's company, watching Sophie play while they shared comfortable conversation. Neither Emily nor David spoke about the future or defined what their growing friendship might become, but both began to look forward to Sundays with an anticipation that had nothing to do with religious obligation and everything to do with the quiet joy of spending time with people who truly saw and appreciated them. Spring brought new life to the church community, and with it, Father Miguel's announcement of the annual parish retreat at Camp Galilee, a peaceful lakeside facility about an hour outside town. The weekend retreat was designed for families to strengthen their faith bonds through shared activities, prayer, and fellowship. "I think this would be wonderful for you and Sophie," David suggested to Emily as they walked out of church the Sunday after the retreat was announced. "Sophie would love the lake activities, and it might be nice for you to get away from your regular routine for a weekend." Emily's expression grew cautious, the same careful reserve that David had learned to recognize when she felt pressured or uncertain. "That sounds lovely, but I don't think we can make it work," she said, her tone polite but final. "Is it the cost?" David asked gently. "Because the church has scholarships available, and I'd be happy to help with—" "David, no." Emily stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression that was kind but firm. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness, I really do. But I can't accept financial help, and I just can't." Sophie, who had been running ahead to pet a friendly dog, returned to tug on her mother's hand. "Mommy, what can't you do?" "Nothing important, sweetheart," Emily replied, smoothing Sophie's hair. "Let's head home for lunch." As they walked toward their car, David felt a familiar sting of rejection mixed with confusion. He had thought their friendship had grown beyond the careful boundaries Emily maintained with most people, but clearly he had misread the situation. That evening, David called his sister Rachel, who lived 2 states away, but had become his primary source of perspective on navigating life after loss. "I don't understand what I did wrong," David confided. "I thought she might enjoy getting away for a weekend, and I know Sophie would love the camp activities, but Emily shut down the conversation like I'd suggested something inappropriate." Rachel was quiet for a moment before responding. "David, what exactly did you say when you invited her?" "I told her it would be wonderful for her and Sophie, that Sophie would enjoy the lake activities." "But you didn't invite her. You suggested she should go. There's a difference." David frowned, not following his sister's logic. "I don't understand." "Think about it from Emily's perspective," Rachel explained patiently. "She's a single mother who's been managing everything alone for 4 years. She's learned to be completely self-sufficient because she's had to be. When you suggest activities or offer to help with costs, what she probably hears is pity. But that's not what I meant at all. I know that, and deep down she probably knows that too. But David, you haven't actually asked her to spend time with you as—" Well, as more than friends helping each other out. You've been helpful and kind, but you haven't been clear about what you want this relationship to become. The conversation left David with much to consider. The next Sunday, he made a decision that required more courage than he'd needed to summon in years. After church, as Emily was gathering Sophie's belongings and preparing to leave, David approached them with nervous determination. "Emily, could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, noting something different in his tone. "Of course. I wanted to ask you something, and I want to be clear about what I'm asking." David took a deep breath. "Would you and Sophie like to go to the parish retreat with me? Not as friends helping each other out, but as people who care about each other and want to spend time together." Emily's expression shifted through surprise, uncertainty, and something that looked like panic. "David, she began, then stopped, glancing around at the other families packing up their children and heading home to Sunday dinners and afternoon activities that included two parents and easy assumptions about the future. "I can't," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you tell me why?" Emily looked down at Sophie, who was arranging her crayons with typical 5-year-old precision, then back at David with eyes that held years of carefully managed pain. "Because I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me and Sophie. I don't want to be the widow you're trying to help, or the broken family that needs fixing." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I've worked so hard to build a life where Sophie and I are okay on our own, where we're not dependent on anyone else's kindness or charity." "Emily, that's not what this is." "Isn't it?" she interrupted gently. "David, you're a good man. You've been incredibly kind to us. But I need to know that any relationship in my life is built on genuine feeling, not on sympathy for my circumstances." She gathered Sophie's hand and her purse, preparing to leave. "I need to protect Sophie from getting attached to something that might not last. And I need to protect myself from hoping for something that might be based on pity rather than love." As Emily and Sophie walked away, David remained standing in the empty fellowship hall, understanding for the first time that his careful, helpful approach to their relationship had been exactly the wrong strategy. Emily needed to be chosen, not rescued. She needed to be loved for who she was, not helped because of what she'd lost. And David realized he had to find the courage to be vulnerable about his own feelings if he ever wanted Emily to risk being vulnerable about hers. 3 weeks later, Father Miguel received an envelope addressed to him in careful 5-year-old handwriting. Inside was a drawing of a church with stick figures representing her family, and a letter that Sophie had dictated to her preschool teacher during free writing time. "Dear Father Miguel," the letter began in an adult's careful script, "Sophie wanted to share something with you. She asked me to write down her words exactly as she said them." The letter continued in Sophie's voice. "I prayed for God to send a daddy for my mommy, and I think maybe he sent Mr. David. But Mommy says we have to be careful about hoping for things that might not happen. I don't understand why grown-ups make loving each other so complicated. Mr. David makes Mommy smile the real way, and he listens to my stories like they're important. Couldn't you tell them that sometimes God answers prayers by putting nice people next to each other? Love, Sophie." Father Miguel read the letter twice, then made a decision that departed from his usual practice of keeping parishioners' private communications confidential. The following Sunday, he asked for a few extra minutes before the final blessing. "I received a letter this week from one of our youngest congregation members," he began, holding up Sophie's drawing. "With her mother's permission, I'd like to share her perspective on prayer, hope, and the ways that God works in our community." Emily, sitting in her usual pew with Sophie beside her, felt her heart stop as she realized what was about to happen. She glanced toward the back of the church where David sat, but couldn't read his expression from that distance. Father Miguel read Sophie's letter aloud, his voice gentle but carrying clearly throughout the small sanctuary. As her words filled the space, Emily felt tears threatening to spill over. Sophie had somehow articulated the feelings that Emily had been too afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. When Father Miguel finished reading, the church was completely silent for a long moment. Then, to Emily's amazement, David stood up. "Father Miguel," David said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "may I respond to Sophie's letter?" Emily's heart hammered as Father Miguel nodded, and David walked slowly down the aisle toward the front of the church. Every eye in the congregation was on him, but David's gaze was fixed on Emily and Sophie. "Sophie," David said, addressing the little girl directly, "your letter made me realize something important. I've been afraid to tell your mommy how much you both mean to me, because I was scared she might say no." He turned slightly to include Emily in his words. "Emily, I've been praying too, ever since that first Sunday, when I heard Sophie ask God for a daddy for her mommy. I've been praying for the courage to tell you that I love you. Not because you need help, but because you're funny and kind and strong and beautiful. I love how you mother Sophie with such dedication. I love how you find joy in small things. I love the way you make me want to be a better man." Emily's tears were flowing freely now, but she couldn't look away from David's earnest face. "Sophie," David continued, "I can't promise to be exactly like the daddy you remember in pictures. But I can promise that if your mommy says yes, I will love you both for the rest of my life. I will show up for school plays and soccer games and bedtime stories. I will help with math homework and teach you to ride a bike and listen to all your important stories." He paused, taking a deep breath before addressing Emily directly. "Emily Matthews, will you marry me? Will you let me be Sophie's stepfather and your husband? Will you let us build a family together?" The church held its collective breath as Emily stood up slowly, Sophie's hand still clasped in hers. For a moment she seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by the public nature of the proposal and the weight of the decision. Then Sophie tugged on her hand and whispered loudly enough for the front rows to hear, "Mommy, say yes. That's what I prayed for." Emily laughed through her tears, looking down at her daughter's eager face and then back at David, who waited with patient hope. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, David. Yes to all of it." The congregation erupted in applause as David closed the distance between them and gathered both Emily and Sophie into an embrace that felt like coming home. Sophie giggled with delight, wrapping her small arms around David's neck and declaring loudly, "God answered my prayer." Father Miguel wiped his own eyes as he watched the three of them hold each other, then raised his hand for quiet. "It seems we have more to celebrate than usual today," he said with a warm smile. "Sometimes God's greatest miracles happen not through grand gestures, but through the simple willingness of people to open their hearts to love." As the service concluded and congregation members surrounded them with congratulations and tears of joy, Emily found herself marveling at how Sophie's innocent prayer had set in motion a series of events that led to this moment. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching David's courtship of Emily with grandmotherly approval, hugged them both tightly. "I knew from the beginning that boy was sweet on you," she told Emily. "Some things are just meant to be." Later, as they sat in the fellowship hall sharing cake that someone had quickly assembled from the church kitchen, Sophie climbed onto David's lap with the familiarity of a child who had already claimed him as family. "Mr. David," she said seriously, "now that you're going to be my daddy, can you teach me to whistle? Mommies aren't very good at whistling." "I think I can manage that," David replied, kissing the top of her head. "But first I need to learn how to braid hair, because daddies need to know how to do little girls' hair for school." Emily watched this exchange with a heart so full it almost hurt. She had spent 4 years believing that her story was about loss and survival, never imagining that it might actually be about preparation for a love she hadn't even known she was waiting for. How do you feel knowing the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Heroine so you never miss incredible stories like this one. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, very similar to the day Sophie had first prayed for a daddy for her mommy, St. Mary's Chapel was decorated with simple white flowers and golden leaves that matched the season's natural beauty. The same stained glass windows that had witnessed Sophie's prayer now cast rainbow patterns across the altar where Emily and David were about to exchange vows. Emily wore a simple ivory dress that Sophie had helped choose, and David stood at the altar in a dark suit with a boutonniere that Sophie had insisted include baby's breath because it looks like little clouds. Sophie herself was the flower girl, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration she brought to all important tasks. The wedding was deliberately small, just close friends, fellow congregation members, and family who had traveled to witness the celebration of a love story that had begun with a child's prayer. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in joy and genuine emotion. Father Miguel, who had become somewhat of a celebrity in church circles for his role in bringing Emily and David together, spoke about the mysterious ways that faith and love intersect in ordinary lives. Today we celebrate not just the union of Emily and David, but the reminder that sometimes our most heartfelt prayers are answered through the people God places in our path, he said, smiling at Sophie, who was sitting in the front row between Emily's parents and David's sister Rachel. When it came time for vows, David surprised everyone by addressing Sophie directly before speaking to Emily. "Sophie," he said, kneeling to her level, "I promise to love your mommy with all my heart. I promise to be the daddy you prayed for, to listen to your stories, help with your homework, and teach you everything I know about being brave and kind. Will you help me be the best daddy I can be?" Sophie nodded solemnly, then whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I knew God would send you. I just had to wait a little bit." Emily's vows were equally personal, thanking David not just for loving her, but for seeing past her grief to the woman she was becoming, and for loving Sophie as if she were his own daughter from the moment they met. "You didn't just answer Sophie's prayer," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "You answered prayers I didn't even know I was praying." The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with autumn flowers and filled with laughter, music, and the kind of celebration that happens when a community witnesses something genuinely wonderful. Sophie danced with her new father, her feet standing on his shoes as he spun her around the small dance floor. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Father Miguel announced that Emily and David had requested that wedding gifts be donated to a new fund they were establishing, the Sophie's Prayer Foundation, designed to support single-parent families in the community with everything from emergency financial assistance to childcare during difficult times. "We know what it's like to feel alone and overwhelmed," Emily explained to the gathering. "We want to make sure other families know they have support and that their children's prayers are heard." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Emily, David, and Sophie found themselves sitting together in the same pew where Sophie had first prayed for a daddy for her mommy. The church was quiet now, lit only by the soft evening light filtering through the stained glass windows. "Was this what you imagined when you prayed for a daddy?" Emily asked Sophie, who was curled up between her new parents, still wearing her flower girl dress, but with her shoes kicked off. "It's better," Sophie said sleepily. "I just asked for a daddy for you, but God sent me a daddy too. And now we're a real family." David wrapped his arms around both his girls, marveling at how completely his life had changed since that Sunday morning, when a little girl's innocent prayer had opened his heart to possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. "Sometimes," Emily said softly, "a child's prayer can open the most miraculous doors." Outside, the autumn evening was peaceful and full of promise, just like the family that had been born from faith, hope, and the simple belief that love finds a way when hearts are open to receive it. If you believe that love and kindness can create miracles, please subscribe to Hidden Heroine. Let's spread these heartwarming stories together.